Okay, hello everyone, welcome to the new Science Jam. Today I'm happy to introduce Saramäki. He came here from Maastricht during his conference week and he comes to give us a talk, very nice of him. At the moment, Jari is a full professor at the Department of Computer Science on the Aalto University of Finland. And you have quite a wide background as far as I saw. You started as a PhD in superfluids?
Yes.
And that was very, I love to talk about it later, but yeah, we are in a hurry.
Yes.
But you also work in industry, I saw, and it was funny because you worked in industry on data science before data science.
Before there was data science.
Before data
Yes.
science. But at the moment you work on computer networks.
Yes.
And I'm prepared aside with what you want to bring temporal networks, new interactions.
Very good. Thank you. Yes, so I thought I'll give a sort of overview of some results and some studies on human behavior and interactions between humans, done using the framework of network science. And what's network science? This we discussed already a bit. Like, is it like random graphs? Well, network science is mostly run by physicists, so it's like random graphs, but much more dirty. We don't do formal proofs or anything like that. So it's more like the physics of the thing. The methods sort of originate in that mindset, but there's a lot of data science and a lot of algorithms and computer science involved nowadays. Right. So what sort of networks do network scientists study? There are, maybe I should step aside. This will be probably easier, right? Work. Very good. Yes. So what sort of networks do we study? I've studied almost all of these systems except for power grids. And the point is that very many natural systems can be modeled as network structures where you have nodes that are connected by links. And that's like a high-dimensional complex structure that tells you about what the system is doing. And also you can consider the links and links of the network to act as sort of constraints on any dynamics on top of the network. For example, if we think of human social networks, then we can consider information flows taking place on top of those networks, and the network then acts as a sort of substrate on top of which something flows. In this talk, I'll be focusing on social networks, but ideas related to the human brain will make a short appearance at some point as well. So, I have to get rid of this.
Maybe you have to press on the X.
Sometimes this Zoom is pretty long.
Yes.
Okay, now it is success. Very good. Right. So I'm going to be talking about mostly about social network of humans and social behavior of humans. So why is this of interest to people like me, and why is this of interest to complexity scientists? Well, we are talking about emergent structures that sort of arise out of the actions of the individual without any sort of blueprint. People do what they do, they behave as they do, and their relationships and connections give rise to some structures that we can then observe. And social networks have wherever you look at them, if you look at people's face-to-face interactions, or you look at some online interactions, you look at them at different cultures, you will always see certain features that are there. So this is something that really intrinsic in us humans, that we like to structure our networks in a certain way. I'll talk a bit more about that in a bit. Then there's, of course, the several other points of view, kind of the technology point of view. We have so many online social networks. They have changed our lives. They have changed very many things. So what's all this? How do we interact through such networks? And then why do such networks change the world the way they do? How do people manage to somehow start using technology in a slightly different way that was originally intended? social media was not supposed to be a polarizing thing. It was supposed to be information availability to everyone, people being able to network all over the globe, and then something else kind of emerged of it, for example. And to those who study online networks, all this polarization phenomena has been visible for a very, very long time before it sort of made an appearance in politics. This is from some Twitter between mentioned network in US politics already in 2014. You can see it's highly polarized. So there's one bubble, there's another bubble, they are really not talking to one another. And social media has a tendency of amplifying such structures because of the way it is built. Now all this has led to the emergence of something called computational social science, which is partially overlapping with network science, partially overlapping with some complexity sciences, and of course overlapping a lot with what traditional social sciences, where all different forms of data are used to understand human behavior, and typically at scale, instead of the traditional social science way of running surveys where you can catch maybe 1,000, maybe if you pay a lot, you can catch 10,000 respondents. But with such databases, we can easily go up to meet sort of nationwide scales if we look at mobile operator data, for example. So I'm going to be talking about two different time scales today. First of all, time scale, and I'll be looking for patterns that are sort of time invariant when some other things change in our social networks. I'll explain that in a bit. And then I'll go for a far shorter time scales and look for structures that emerge from individual emails or phone calls or other timed interactions. So that's like the latter part of the talk. So we'll start with our persistent patterns of how we structure and maintain our social networks. The starting point here is that if we think of our personal network, so me or you and all the people you know, how do you manage that lot? How many people can you know? How many good friends can you have? How many very close people can you have? And how is this all structured? And the ideas start from these two constraints that, of course, we can't have 10,000 friends, or we can't have 500 extremely close others. So there are obvious constraints. Why are there constraints there? First thing is time. There's only so much of it. And the more emotionally intensive a social relationship is, the more time we need to devote to that. Because we need to sort of build a model of the other's mind, we need to understand the other person, and that doesn't happen just like this through a single tweet or through something. We need to put time on the relationship, and there's an obvious cap there. And the other one is brain power, sort of closely related. We need to use our brain power to understand the other person. And here, it's not only about our friends and relatives and other people we know in isolation, because they also form a system, right? So if you have k friends, then k times k minus 1 divided by 2 connections, or potential connections exist between them, right? And this is something that you should somehow understand in order to navigate the social system, right? That how do these people relate to one another? And that's a huge number, of course. It scales very badly as the number of people goes up. It helps that you can typically sort of group people, that these people here are my colleagues, those are my friends, they don't even know one another, I don't need to care. But still, we need to navigate rather complicated landscapes. And our brains, there hasn't been very much like evolutionary pressure lately on our brains. So most of the social wiring diagrams inside our brain come from very early times, sort of from us being sort of proto-humans that were parts of very small tribes, and that's how our brains have evolved. Human social networks and other primate social networks are remarkably alike, actually, when you look at the structure. So, what sort of evidence is there for these constraints? The figure on the top left is from Robin Dunbar's famous article, where he simply produced a scatter plot of the size of social groups of primates and their neocortex size. So here the idea was that actually what has been driving the development of our brain in evolution is social interaction. Because we need to have a bigger brain in order to manage more complicated situations. And then when it comes to the time constraint, there is a lot of evidence available from all possible online platforms, which basically simply shows that the more people you have in your network, the less time you spend with each of them, because there's a cap on your time. And that's rather natural. So I'll start here with one study that we did a bit more than 10 years ago with some people at Oxford University, Robin Dunbar, Felix Ritsokas, and others. We had a small but super detailed data set on students in the UK who finished high school and then went elsewhere to university in different cities. Right? So they were at the time when their personal networks underwent tremendous changes, right? So you left your old friends behind, you went to university, you learned to know new people. And we wanted to sort of try to understand, is there something that persists under such change? Because you know that the network composition changes, but is there something in the network structure that remains the same? And to this end, we used call data. So we had timestamped information of all of their phone calls for a period of 18 months, basically passed from their electronic phone bills. So they volunteered to the study, and we got their phone bills that had itemized phone calls, and someone went and passed that electronically. Good. So what we did with this data, anyway, okay, so what we did with this data was that we constructed egocentric networks where one student is at the center and all the people they ever called are around them. And then we simply counted the numbers of calls in each of these three 6-month intervals. We divided the data into 3 consecutive chunks. Look at some person, they made not many calls in this window, they made that many calls in that window to each of their friends and relatives. And then, without at this stage looking at the identities of the people in their networks, we just sorted this. So what fraction of your calls went to the person that you called the most, what fraction of your calls went to the person that you called second most, and so on. And what we saw there was that there is a very typical pattern, which looks like this, that doesn't really change in time. And how you read this rank frequency plot is simply that people tend to mostly call a handful of others. So people have few very strong social ties, and they allocate a lot of their effort on those social ties. And then increasing number of others that they call once, twice, sometimes, but not very frequent. And this is a very common pattern. It doesn't change in time, even though here in the first interval, these people were still in high school. In the second interval, they were already at university. And in the third interval, that was like after their first university year. So the pattern is remarkably unchanging. And even if you look at this pattern at the level of individual people, you'll see that there's, of course, some noise, some fluctuations, but you can almost recognize that this is that person's pattern. This person has a bit of a different pattern, and those persist in time. This means that if I'm someone who likes to have one very strong relationship, and then I put much less of my time on others, I will remain that way. even though people around me change, even though that single strong relationship might also be replaced by someone else, but that's the way I sort of run my social circle. Or if I'm someone who has a more flat social structure, that I have many friends, I divide my time more evenly among them, then this is what happens. And you see that statistically by combining these social signature, by measuring the time differences of these social signature shapes and comparing those against the randomized counterpart, where I just compare my signature to your signature or your signature in random. And then you see that this you can use Jensen-Shannon divergence to do so if you consider these signatures as probability distributions, and then you see that typically my own pattern, my own signature remains closer to my signature than it is to others in the set of data. So this is very persistent. So this was a very small study.
Question. Did you do anything with the call duration, or is it simply
No, here we didn't. But call duration correlates extremely highly with number of calls in this case. There are some sort of cases where when call duration carries more, the sum of call durations carries more information. And that's a bit different between females and males. So there are these kind of sort of subtle differences. But if I just do a scatter plot of how many hours did you spend on the phone and how many calls did you make, this is a very, very, very linear dependency. So that was a small data set of students in the UK and their mobile phone calls. Later on, we and others have looked at this in other sets of data, other phone call sets of data, and I will come to this in a bit in many other electronic forms of communication, and this seems to hold. So there is this common pattern, and everyone has their own sort of fingerprint signature pattern that they have. But then we will have the question of what does this mean? We can read it as something that we have used strong relationships. We have more, less strong or less intense relationship. But we were just looking at phone calls. So do phone calls capture everything? They probably don't, because we carry out our social interactions in very many different ways. And mind you, this was like the data here was from before 2010. So we didn't have all these different services people use nowadays. We didn't have TikToks and WhatsApps and whatnot. So this captured more about people's interactions. But you can still ask what sort of a reflection of a true underlying social network, if any, do you get if you look at such data alone? And to this end, we first started toying with two different communication channels, which were included in those data sets: phone calls and text messages. And we looked at social patterns, social signatures generated using either of those or both of those at the same time. To use both of those at the same time, you need to do a bit of a matching, because of course, one phone call can be like one conversation, but one text message is typically just part of the conversation, so you can't just directly compare the numbers. So to construct a multi-channel thing, we coarse-grained it over time. So looked at the number of hours with communication along different channels. And what you get then is something very similar. So you will have signatures that look alike, whether they are individual text or calls or mixed, and you will have the same kind of persistence taking place and all that. So it looks the same on two different channels, but the mystery there is that if you look at who do these students call or text, those are different sets of people. They're only partially all of that. So my social behavior on one channel looks like it does on another channel, but they are slightly different people in these different channels. So what does this basically mean or reflect? This is kind of an open question because it's made even more complicated. Skip that and go directly here. It's made even slightly more complicated by very recent results where we basically took all possible communication data sources that we could ever find and repeat the similar experiment. Here we, instead of looking at these curved signatures, we just capture the shape with the single parameter, and we look at how people's parameter values change in time. And you see that's the curve on the right. They don't. It's centered very well centered around 0 in very many different types of data sets. And then this is sort of puzzling that you would think that if I look at messages on an internet forum or dating website or something else, they probably don't reflect your real world social circles that much, right? But still, the shape is the same. So we still build a similar network around us if we are on an online platform interacting with strangers, basically. And this is part of the mystery that hasn't really been solved yet. Why is this so? There are different candidate explanations. You could think that this is how we evolved to be. This is hardwired in our brains. This is what you see in private networks. If you take some baboon grooming data and then you compute how much they groom with other baboons and then you construct these signatures, you get the similar. So it might be that we just inherit this pattern from our primate ancestors. But it can also be something much more mundane, like I went to this online forum. I have a nick there. There are some other nicknames. I don't know these people, but I started talking with that person. And now it's easier to carry on the conversation rather than to sort of invest the time and effort to start talking with some other. So it's like a self-reinforcing process, right? You start something, then you kind of made the investment already, so it pays off to keep on doing so. And that's why we have such network shapes. But it's not well understood yet, and I don't have any very good experiments even in mind how to test for this. But maybe really looking at primate data sets and looking at sort of what sort of patterns emerge in them might be one way to go. Good. So to summarize this part of my talk that deals with patterns that remain similar in time, even though there are changes, we organize our social networks, egocentric networks, in a way where the top alters. Alter is the social science term for friend, relative, colleague, whatever, someone who's not you, but to whom you are connected somehow. So we have few people who get most of our attention, the rest get less. We shape this pattern in a way that's sort of individual to us. So we all have a bit of different signatures, and those are persistent. And this happens on all platforms for reasons that we don't know. Very good. Questions about this part? Yes.
Something that really strikes me about the last result about the universality with different modalities is that what I would have said that as time changes, as decades pass, a sort of like combination of the different social ties remains constant. But what you show in the previous picture is that in practice, each of them singularly have the same pattern.
Yes.
But something that I would have said is that, for example, if you do the code experiment 20 years ago, you would see this ego network pattern. But if you do the same experiment now, probably at least like my generation and the previous ones have a completely flat.
You don't have a pattern. You don't anymore make phone calls.
So what I would have said there is that if you do the experiment now, you have to do a sort of composition between text, WhatsApp, and calls
exactly.
to get the same pattern.
And this sort of seems to indicate that you would see the same pattern alone on those channels. If you combine them, you would see the pattern, but you would still see probably in each of the channels. And this would be...
I would have said the contrary, so that you see it when you combine, but not when you have the single ones.
Yes, But here we combine calls and text, we see.
Right.
We look at all these different we still, and this is really counterintuitive to me, because I also thought, I see it from a company, I think I refer to network is like this. With those people I text, with those people I call, with those people I WhatsApp, with those people I meet, and I sum all, and then I get the same pattern. But it seems that the sub patterns look sort of much alike, and this is something that requires further work.
Right. And maybe another question that is related to your first premises, which is that the constraints that drive social patterns come from either time or brain or both of them together.
Yes.
So the question is, does these results reflect? It's more like an interpretation for you.
It's more like an interpretation. Yes, it's impossible.
Do they reflect how humans create social ties, or how humans interact with the technology to get an output?
I would say that it reflects how humans create social ties, because really you see this in other primates. So their networks look alike. So this would to me indicate that it's something that's sort of kind of hardwired in such. We need a few close relationships. We can't handle tens of close relationships, and that's the same with us and chimpanzees and baboons. Yeah. But this is just interpretation. It's not hard facts, you know. Yeah.
So one of your key claims is that these individual patterns, they remain stable over time within individuals, right?
Within some variation, yes.
Yeah. So what is the longest time span?
Yeah. Okay. That's a very good. So this is a good point. And yeah, when I say they remain the same, we are now talking about time span of years, maybe. So this was just 18 months. I would assume that they change dramatically if you take a time span of 20 years, because we all know that as teenagers, we are not the same as we are when we are middle-aged. So it's well known that your networks tend to, especially for males, the networks tend to shrink. Where you get older, you will have sort of fewer, maybe more high-quality relationships. So there's change over long enough periods.
Especially because also these constraints they change too.
They change, yeah.
And the amount of time that you have available for a relationship gets reduced, and also your brain still changes between.
Yes, this is correct.
Okay.
This is correct. So this is more like if I take these people now and then put them somewhere else and they need to reshape their social lives, then it will still look the same. But if I look at the same people in 20 years, then there would be much more of a difference. But there is no data on that. This is something that would be lovely to have.
One other related thing that slightly puzzles me is that many relationships are sort of two-sided, right? So to maintain a friendship, you need investments on both sides.
Yes.
From that perspective, you would not necessarily expect that these things are so stable within individuals, because even if your investment has like a stable pattern, other people's investment might change because the conditions change and the people change. So that those are external forces.
This is correct.
Yes.
But this somehow seems to indicate that if I would still want to invest, but someone else moves away, for example, and I sort of lose them in my social circles, then I have a bit of extra something to invest, and I put that on some other relationship just to keep the pattern kind of stable. Very good. Shall I move on to the second part? I have about 15 minutes, 20 minutes. Right, but so that was like longish time scales. Now we go to very short times, well, seconds. And we look at patterns that we can extract from detailed timestamp data on interactions. I'll show an animation which is pretty old, but which is quite informative. This mess here is part of a social network of people. The social network inferred from the phone calls. So as you can see, there are very many links there. There are very many triangles, as in always in social network. So one link here is between two people. The nodes are not really visible, but yeah, that's a network. And I will show how text messages and phone calls play out on this network. Looks like this. These are phone calls, now in accelerated time. And you can see patterns there, right? So these arrows are not just like randomly flashing. but you have patterns that reflect interactions. Very often you have these chains, A equals B equals C. You have these ping pong patterns that A equals B equals A equals B. And you have other sort of ways of coordinate. Now there was a very nice pattern there in the middle. You also see exactly this, that now it's time. So it's quiet, people don't make phone calls or text messages, and now then it starts in the afternoon, things start again in this part of the network. So we have these very fast time scales that are informative of what people do, and then we have these a bit longer cycles that also tell about human behavior, basically that they sleep at night. Good. And if you go to this super detailed time scale, there are very many different types of patterns and ideas that you can extract from such sets of data. I'll quickly mention some of them. At some point, everyone in networks was working on burstiness, because burstiness is a feature that human communication has, which is something that sort of deviates from expectation. We do not, if I look at the timeline of the interactions between two persons, and I look at the inter-event times, these are really far from Poisson or some more uniform distributions. Rather, they look more like parallels. So you have many events happening in a short period of time, then you have long waiting times between events, and then you have other bursts happen. This is very common to humans. This has been seen both in mobile phone call data like here and in letter exchanges between Einstein and others, and in very many other types of human interactions that we do not interact uniformly in time, but rather with broad inter-event time distribution. Then, as you saw in this animation, often these times are correlated. So I call someone, that someone calls someone else, they call me, so there are these patterns taking place. And from those you can extract so-called temporal motifs. So you can take a network where these things happen, and you can kind of extract all ABC triangles from there, or all chains of A, B, C, D, or other patterns, like a temporal zoo of animals that you can extract from such sets of data. And then you have other things like the daily activity cycles. You may have things like change points where the whole network sort of changes its mode of operations and so on. So there are very many different types of patterns that you can extract from those networks that are informative of human behavior. Burstiness, I already mentioned, this is just that made visible. That's from one mobile phone call dataset. So you see that there is no uniform spread of calls in time, but rather it's quite broadly distributed. Another thing is that if we think of networks as substrates, if we think of the network of phone calls as something on top of which information is transmitted, right? So we can think that each phone call transmits some piece of information, and we track the paths of this information on top of this temporal network. Then we know that the exact dynamics of when things happen affect this process so on. So whatever happens on top of the network is highly dependent on the exact timings of the interaction events between people. This burstiness, for example, is known to slow things down because there will be long waiting times on temporal paths. But as a general phenomenon, this is quite important. This is also rather relevant for disease spreading, because if we think of the substrate for disease spreading, it is a spatiotemporal contact network between people. So people have to be roughly in the same location at roughly the same time for something to be transmitted. And the patterns of this network are then the ones that dictate how spreading process unfolds. These are just jump over. Okay, quickly about these temporal patterns, that you can also extract some patterns like these temporal motifs from the data, and then you can study their composition in terms of who is part of. If your data happens to have metadata, you can study their composition in terms of who happens to be part of the pattern. And this is from one paper of ours where we look at these very simple different types of chains. and we saw that there's a big difference between males and females in our data. And to put this short is that men are simple. They just call one another ping pong, back and forth. And women tend to participate in more diverse patterns, are more like group-oriented patterns. So that was a clear finding in this set of data. Then the information that is not even in who interacts with whom, but when do people in general interact. That's also something that you can extract out of such sets of data. This is from, again, I think this is from the very same phone call data as the social signatures part was. We simply looked at when do these people call, when do they make their phone calls. We were actually looking for something entirely else, but this emerged that we saw that, there's a very, very, very persistent thing here as well, that the student in panel A is rather morning active as compared to the average, and the student in panel G is very, very evening and late night active as compared to the average. And these again are persistent. You look at the same people 6 months from now, they behave the same. So you could detect the individual chronotypes. This is called chronotype, whether you are a morning or an evening person from the data, and these are remarkably persistent. And this is something you see in very many different communication data sets, that people have their own circadian patterns that are quite unchanging. Then we went a bit further with these ideas. So we took another data set where about 1,000 students were tracked for a year. This is a super high quality data set collected by some of my colleagues in Denmark. About 1,000 students were equipped with smartphones with tracking software that tracked everything. They were basically given those phones and in exchange to participation in this program. And those phones recorded a ton of different data streams from calls and messages to Bluetooth proximity, which is something that many people have used in disease spreading studies, because this is a very good data set of how people actually interact in space. We use the screen on and off signals, which is basically when you tap on your phone, when you turn it off, when you do something on your phone, because then you can get beautifully all these patterns. You don't need to make a phone call. You can just sort of in the morning wake up and silence your alarm, and then this gives us signals. And we got very, very similar patterns that we could see that there's someone who is always active in the evening at night, there's someone who's always active in the morning, and we could basically label these 1,000 students in terms of their chronotypes. And the next thing we wanted to do is then, okay, let's put them on a network, because this is also a network data set. We know who's friends with whom through Facebook, we know who calls whom, we can construct their social network. And then let's look at where are the chronotypes in this network. Now, this is a student data set, so there's a peculiar pattern, or not so peculiar pattern here. So if you want to be central, you need to be up at night, because all the student parties are at night. So those people in the social network who have a lot of evening activity tend to be more central. And those people who have more morning activity, the ones who get the best grades in the exams, tend to be on the outskirts of the social network because of their activity. I don't think that this extends to the whole of humanity, but for students this was a pretty clear pattern. But this is how it works. And still continuing this idea of weekly and daily patterns, then you can do even more in-depth studies. You can basically generate a multi-layer network of your large data set and divide people's social relationships to relationships that are mostly maintained on weekdays or weekends or evenings and so on. So you can get a pretty good picture of how people time-wise structure their social lives. Good. So that much then for, yes, I'm well in time. That much for this point. So there's there are very many data sets out there with super fine-grained temporal information and human interactions, and you can extract very many different types of behavioral patterns out of such data sets. And this was really like a data science talk in that I didn't go to the theory behind all this at all, because you can also, for burstiness, for example, and its effects on things, then you can simply by knowing that these distributions exist, you can go and do something like theoretical physics of human interactions and drive a lot of mathematical properties of these systems from knowing this. But yeah, so to summarize the whole talk, our social networks are structured so that we have few strong relationships, more weaker relationships. And actually, if you put then these networks together, you will get a pattern like this, where the strong relationships form groups and the weak links connect the different groups. We have persistent ways of structuring our social interactions, and the communication patterns that we have and interaction patterns can be highly informative about things. Very good. Thank you. Questions?
Yeah, there are questions.
So very impressive work. Thanks a lot for the interesting presentation. So I'm a sociologist, studying networks also. And I mean, don't get me wrong, I really like this type of work, but from a sociology perspective, it's also easy to be skeptical about some points. For example, in your previous slides, the first 2 points. So we have a few strong ties and many weak ties. We could argue that we already knew that.
Yeah, that's
from
correct.
decades of survey.
That's absolutely correct. So from Granovetter's work and all that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
So you could argue, now we know it in a bit more detail.
Yes.
But does that really add to our understanding? On the last point, like our chronotypes determine our networks. That was roughly the point, I think. A sociologist would argue, well, this is a very reductionist perspective, because whether you're up at night or in the morning could be a personal preference.
Yeah, it could be many things.
It could be hardwired, but it could also be a result of your social environment. You could have a night job or a morning job, or
That's absolutely correct.
be based on or class, whatever.
And so in this case, I mean, what I showed was a correlation that if you place these people in the network, then this is what you see, and the party part is more like an interpretation that this is the probable cause behind it, but it's not really. Regarding the weak links, strong links thing, yes, I mean, correct. However, then, and I didn't go to the maths here, so that follows from the social science. But originally, we did many of these studies were inspired by work of Granovetter and others. So a long time ago, I didn't even show the study that's behind this picture, where we actually take 7 million people and look at the strong and weak class and how the whole system is structured. But when you do that using these mathematical notions, then you can actually get to somewhere which is beyond the social science theories, which is how this pattern shapes information flow, really shapes information flow on the network, or at least in theory shapes information flow on the network, and so I didn't have time to get into that. But here you're absolutely correct. These things confirm things that were either known or people were pretty sure that this is how it must be. I also work with social scientists that usually give me a hard time with all this physics. Because one thing, and I kind of, this was sort of, I sort of swept under the carpet here, is that firstly, then one of them, when I talk about networks, they, but your ties, are they family ties, or are they friendship ties, or maybe romantic ties? Because of course it matters, not all ties are alike. And as physicists tend to say, no, it's a structure, it's like a connection matrix, it's like these 2 points are connected, and they are like, but is that a romantic tie or a friendship tie? Matters, so.
Yeah, one let's say broader theoretical point here, which I think your type of temporal approach is very useful, is that this whole notion of networks as sort of a stable thing is actually also a theoretical metaphor.
Yes, absolutely.
That we impose on reality, and of course these relationships, they don't exist all the time.
Yes,
sometimes
exactly.
Sometimes there's not, and
Nice.
there's this kind of temporal way of looking at it as a potential changes the whole network paradigm.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, so I was actually wondering if there are maybe a bit, difficult finding it difficult to formulate the question. Universal motifs in this, and in particular, I'm always very fascinated about polarization, which you started your talk with. Are there universal motifs following things in time that you could actually show that works for polarization?
Okay, polarization,
social networks.
And that's something that I have not studied that much myself. I have colleagues who have worked on that and using very many different types of data sets. And here they would first ask, what do you mean by polarization? Do you mean this or that? Because there are very many different ways of sort of measuring it. But if you look at this kind of network fragmentation, yes.
Like this kind of structure that you
that I showed in the beginning.
I mean,
I think it's something that slowly emerges, because if you can think of very simple, again, mathematically you can think of very simple processes that suppose that I have my preferences, that I'd like to interact a bit more with people who are a bit more like me and a bit less with people who are not like me. And you iterate that over time in a network, you start weakening ties to others who are. So it's kind of a slow process, a bit like these shelling models and other sort of models of segregation a long time ago that happened on spatial grids. So it's not something that happens like this, but it's a slow thing that. And of course, what happens in the online world is that you have algorithms that boost it, and that boost it in sort of funny ways that you could even think that it's not even that you are similar with someone else and like to interact with them, but you together like sort of ridicule others who have very wrong opinions, right? And that's what the algorithms boost, because they get a strong between groups reaction, not like a strong within group reaction somehow. So these algorithms do play a role, but that's something that's slightly beyond my own expertise. How does that work in network terms?
And being a physicist, I always wonder whether that these patterns are, there is some form of a universality in this fragmentation.
I think so, yes. I think so. There is a very sort of fairly simple network processes that always lead to the same outcome if you have these slight preferences.
Right.
That's at the same time, common claim is that this has become a lot worse recently. So if it's these kind of universal sort of mechanisms, how come we weren't polarized all along? No.
Right.
And we're also not that polarized.
Right?
If it's just these basic mechanisms that drive separation, we would not expect it to say that the amount of mixture that there still is. So it cannot be just that.
Yeah, I think there's sort of very many different things behind, but there's also things that boost it. So the speed of something can change because there are mechanisms online that really like pure gasoline on the fire. So.
And to that, there are things that actually force polarization. For example, if you have to choose between one or other, then you have to choose in these two sides. Actually, a question in your research, because the data you use, what kind of characteristics do you actually take account of? Because you have, for example, male and female differences, but there are more differences you could take.
Sure.
And I think, for example, age would be very interesting to see, because but also maybe profession, education. I feel like some of my friends with different educations do different kind of things.
Yes. So it depends a lot on the data set. I mean, here I've shown results from many different data sets. Some of the mobile phone call data sets that we have simply contain gender, age, and possibly something about zip code or area. And then things like the Copenhagen data set that was used in the chronotype, I guess, contains a lot more, because people ask very, very, very many questions. And for these temporal motifs, we also look at age groups, and there you can see the sort of not a social scientist would again say not at all unexpected thing that people tend to interact with others of the same age, which is not very sort of earth-shattering, that you know that there's these sort of homopathy patterns exist. And actually, most of the official disease spreading models are built on those, because you know that there are more contacts within certain age groups and between age groups, and these you can use for modeling disease spreading, for example.
Yeah, I would find it quite interesting to see how networks actually develop over age. If you're trying
that would be extremely useful to see, but there are the problem with that is that even now, especially nowadays, is that you have, if you look at online data software, all the kids use 50 different things and they change all the time. So I mean, they use this service today and tomorrow they will use another, next year fashion. So there will be no way of tracking anything even over 2 years, let alone longer. So that's a real difficulty. We've been studying with some data how family networks we have a Finnish data set where you have some family lineages that start from 1700 something, and we track those lineages over 300 years of time. But it's only like how many relatives you have and where do they live near to you, and you can get this kind of family part of the network and its time evolution over centuries. But other social relationships are completely undocumented, so you can't get anything from them, unfortunately.
Maybe one last question. How do you deal with group chats? For example, I know some of my friends only interact in groups.
Mhm.
They do not have so many individual messages.
Paragraphs.
Do you also account for these kind of things that people interact with big groups?
Yes, you need to use some sort of hypergraph models for that. So higher order networks or simply short notices or some things like that, where you have multi-body interactions instead of two-body interactions.
Well, if there's no more question, then we get to Jari.
Thank you very much.